Surrender of premises. George, I think this one is on you.
All good things must come to an end. So at some point, the lease is going to terminate. The tenant's going to have to move out, assuming they haven't exercised a renewal or an extension option. And you need to define in the lease what happens then. Well, before you get to that point, the landlord wants to reserve the right to show the space to prospective tenants at some point in time. Now, tenants don't like new people trekking through their space. You may have confidential records, or you just don't want disrupting your business operations. But it's important from the landlord's perspective to say, listen, 90 days before the end of the lease term, I get to start showing your space during normal business hours on a reasonable basis to new tenants, because I got to move someone in before you move, when you move out. So make sure that when you're on the landlord side, you've got provisions in the lease and you reserve that right. Then when you're on the tenant side, take into consideration the particular nature of your client's business. If it's a medical practice, as an example, you don't want people trekking through there because, again, you've got HIPAA laws, you've got all kinds of patient privacy laws, so they may have to be only after-hour type prospective tenant visits, that type of thing. So make sure that the lease is clear as to what the landlord's rights and the tenant's defensive position is with respect to the space being shown before the end of the lease term. The lease term comes to an end, the tenant needs to leave. Obviously, they have to be out on a date certain. If they don't get out on the date certain, they're a holdover tenant. Many leases will have a holdover provision, which says if you stay in the space after the term ends, you're a tenant at sufferance, which is a bad thing to be. It means that you're in default on the lease, the landlord can evict you, and you're paying rent at a premium level. Under Florida law, under New York law, Texas law, and I know Illinois law, there are statutes on the books that say holdover tenants pay rent, absent contrary provision of the lease, at double the rent for commercial leases. So if my law firm were to stay in our space at 200 East Los Alamos Boulevard past the date that our lease is up, we're paying double rent. Now, what we did is we negotiated it back to the landlord and said, hey, we only want to pay 150% if we're a holdover tenant. Sometimes if you're on the tenant side, you're going to try to negotiate a graduated increase in rent. You may want to say the first 2 months that we're there, we're just paying you regular rental rate. After that, it goes up to 125%, 150%, 160%. You do any permutation you want. But one of the things you want to try to do on the tenant side is lessen the blow for them to be your client to be a holdover tenant. Because let's face it, sometimes you can't get into the next space, or there's a delay, or there's a permitting layer. There are lots of things that happen, and this is the hard part of what all of us in this room do. It's the chess game of moving people from building to building, and the timing never works out. So on the tenant side, you want to minimize the economic exposure for holdover rent. Now the landlord's got a completely different perspective and a completely different dynamic. They want the tenant out. And if they don't want the tenant out, they want the tenant to be economically motivated to get the heck out. So you will see landlords be a little more intransigent about negotiating reduced holdover rental rates. And that all plays out, and who wins that argument really becomes the nature of who's got the more leverage in the transaction. But you are going to see a provision that says if you don't surrender the premises on the termination date, you're going to be a tenant of sufferance, holdover rent, and all bets are off. Now, if the lease doesn't say anything about that, and the parties don't do anything about that, the tenant becomes a month-to-month tenant at the existing rental rate. There's case law and statutes in lots of states that provide for that. That means that you're stuck with that tenant for the next month. The law in Florida is that in order to terminate a month-to-month tenancy, you have to give notice of termination 1/2 of the rental period before the date of termination. So if my lease is up on December 31st and I don't get out, the landlord wants, and I become a month-to-month tenant, January goes by, nothing happens. February goes by, nothing happens. Landlord wakes up in March and says, I want you the heck out. You're a month-to-month tenant. The landlord has to give notice before the 15th of the month for us to be out by the 30th. Or we get another month in there.
Can I ask you a question about holdover? Is holdover an occupancy right if the landlord wants the space? Just because I negotiated a holdover, do I have the right to occupy?
No, that's a really good point. And the answer is the lease should make it clear that you're a tenant at sufferance. That term of art, that legal term, means that you don't have the right to be there. All the holdover rent does is define the economic consequence that the landlord is entitled to seek as a remedy against the tenant for staying in the space. That's one of the remedies. The other remedy is you give him a 3-day notice and you run down to county court and you try to get him evicted. So it's really important that property managers be on top of when these leases terminate, what the holdover rates are, and be ready to evict the tenant and start the eviction process. Because again, the eviction process in Florida, it's an accelerated process, but it's not as fast as you want it to be. So Pike's question is really important. Holdover rent is only one of the components of the remedies that landlords have for tenants that stay beyond their welcome period. Now, what happens when the tenant gets out on time? The big issue in this provision of the lease is what kind of condition does the tenant leave the space in when it leaves? Do they get just to walk out, leave the desks and the furniture and all the TI stuff that's in there? Do they have to take the stuff out and restore the space to some kind of vanilla shell condition? The answer is it depends on what you negotiate. It becomes a business point between the landlord and the tenant. So the landlord says, I want you out, I want all your server racks and all your built-ins and all your stuff out, then the tenant has to remove all that stuff, restore the space to a reasonable condition, subject to reasonable wear and tear, and leave the space basically empty. Sometimes the landlord says, just leave, just go. It becomes a point of negotiation. The one thing I'm seeing in the last 10, 15 years in office leases is cabling. Cabling has become a nightmare for landlords. Demoing cable work is a huge pain. And a lot of times, one thing I spend a ridiculous amount of time arguing with tenant lawyers about, and when I'm on the tenant side arguing with landlord lawyers about is what happens to all the cables? Because tenants would just want to walk away. And they're going up to the ducts, they're going up to the chases, they're all on the walls, and no one knows where they're going, they're not properly labeled, they're essentially unusable. And pulling that stuff out is a big pain, and it's expensive, and it becomes a real point of contention. So, again, the landlord's dynamic is restoring the space means removing your cables and cleaning up the risers and the chases. The tenant's perspective is, see ya, we just want to get out of here. It becomes a business point to negotiate, but it's an important one. Restoration is complicated sometimes. Again, if you have warehouse space that's been built out with manufacturing equipment or big storage equipment for industrial type users, when they pull those racks out of the cement slab, they leave these big cracks in this foundation. They leave these big holes where the bolts used to be. And again, your sophisticated landlords in the industrial side like Prologis and Duke, their lease says you've got to take that stuff out, you've got to re-concrete it, you've got to smooth it back to grade to the grade level. You got to take out all the girders and stuff you installed for your winch systems. So you'll see different things in different leases. Retail, same thing. Again, all that stuff that's hard built into the space, landlord's going to want that taken out. And the tenant's going to want to do the least amount they can. They just want to get up and leave. So again, the dynamic between landlord and tenant here is pretty opposite. Whoever has the leverage, whoever really cares about the issue is going to prevail on it. So just pay real careful attention to what happens to you when you surrender the space in restoration.
So Mark, I think that we could probably convince Nat to have cable-ready space when we vacate. And I think that would be an amenity to the space.
See,
Like,
all
it's
right.
the cloud. You don't need one.
You're the cloud.
What are you doing with cables?